What is perhaps the most annoying slogan from Christians who criticize fantasy? That slogan might be something like, "We're not meant to enjoy stories, instead we're supposed to preach the gospel." But what may be the second most annoying slogan about Christian fantasy, only this one from folks who say they like it? That slogan might be something like, "We don't need newer stories if we have Lewis and Tolkien." How then can we as fans respond with grace and truth to Lewis and Tolkien onlyism?
Speculative fiction, like no other genre, reflects the creativity of God.
If you look at the scriptures, you're going to have to see that God uses imagination more than rational discourse.
We are supposed to be image bearers for a vastly creative God.
Reading fantastical fiction opened a portal in my imagination for a place other than just a materialistic world.
I experienced the gospel story with the mind of someone who loved adventure and loved the idea of light conquering darkness.
We're wired for stories that reflect how we see the world in ways that are true.
The story is either pointing to Christ or it's pointing to our need for Christ.
'Tis the season for Fantastical Truth, this podcast from Lorehaven.com, where we explore fantastical stories for God's glory. I'm Stephen Burnett. I publish Lorehaven.com. I'm also the author of a sci-fi novel launching in March 2025 from Enclave Publishing called Above the Circle of Earth. And I am not a Lato. I am not a Lewis and Tolkien onlyist.
And to partially quote Ferris Bueller, a person should not believe in an ism like Lewis and Tolkienism. And I'm Zackary Russell, your co-host for episode 242. Should Christians read Lewis and Tolkien, but no newer fantasy?
Spoiler alert, no. Moving on to our comm station.
Episode
Never
over.
mind. We're going to do a full episode. Come on, it's the end of the year. We're not going to cheat you all. There's some stuff to be said here. For example, where are we hearing this? Why are we hearing this? And of course, how do we respond to this? Yes, we've named it. I don't think I've seen this anywhere. Lewis and Tolkien onlyism. It's more of a sentiment, not so much someone writing an essay about it. There's been no books published about the subject, but it's a meme that I've seen spreading around. And I don't want people to think, by the way, in this episode, that we're opposed to Lewis and Tolkien. Have you been here lately? If you have, then you know. We talk about Lewis and Tolkien a lot. It's a bit of a joke. Like, oh, well, here it must be a day ending in Y. We've quoted C.S. Lewis this time. At this very moment, by the way, I am now rereading Lewis's That Hideous Strength in book form, and I'm listening to The Fellowship of the Ring, having already read it multiple times, but now I'm listening to the audiobook read by Andy Serkis, which is terrific. So if anyone thinks that they are a Lewis and Tolkien fan, I am certainly more.
Yeah, Stephen, this is going to be interesting to talk about because I have just about every single Lewis and Tolkien book on my bookshelf somewhere. And I thought about making a joke about all this that, you know, like, how can people not have, how could you possibly have enough Lewis and Tolkien in your library? But yeah, we are addressing the idea, why would you only have Lewis and Tolkien? Because I can certainly understand why you'd want a lot of Lewis and Tolkien. There's still some Lewis books I need to get my hands on, and I think a couple of Tolkien books I still don't own. It should just give you a hunger for more, and yet it doesn't. A lot of people just want to stop there, and it's very curious to me why that is, and we'll talk about why that is. But I think first we're going to just, we're big fans, obviously, of Lewis and Tolkien, so we're going to talk about that
in just a moment. First, however, a mission update at Lorehaven.com. We're having a lot of on-screen features. That is the short articles we post at Lorehaven.com about some current movie or streaming series or video game or topic of some kind. And we actually had 3 of them last week, running into some holiday specials for you all. The first one was by Tisha Messing. Actually, come to think of it, that was not an on-screen article because it was about the original Wicked book. Thanks to the movie musical, people have been asking, hey, what's in the original book by Gregory Maguire? Well, Tisha Messing got the book back before it was cool, and her title of this piece is, I tried to read the original Wicked book, but did not finish. She DNF'd it on purpose, barely a dozen pages into that thing. And after you read the article, I think you'll understand why, and you would probably not even start the thing. We also have an on-screen article from Marion Jacobs about a Jack Black movie on Paramount Plus called Dear Santa, which presents Satan as another misunderstood villain. It turns out that misspelling of Santa is Satan, the anagram that means you shouldn't celebrate Santa at all at Christmas because facts and logic. Someone told the streaming service and they went, let's make a movie out of that. And not only was it nigh blasphemous, but it had the dumb. So read that article and understand why. We also have an on-screen article from Parker J. Cole about the Rings of Power Season 2, which in Parker's reckoning ran aground because of constant character shipping. So these ships were not well able to sail the sundering seas because they kept striking the sandbars of what Parker felt were not good romances. And Parker literally professionally writes romance for a living, historical romance, but she also knows her Tolkien very well. Fantastic article. Really enjoyed it. We'll have all those links in the show notes. And to get the articles before you hear about them here on the podcast, subscribe free at lorehaven.com. We will also email you the exclusive code to join the Lorehaven Guild server on Discord. More on that later in the show. Our top sponsor is audioepic.com. That is courtesy of our friends at Oasis Family Media, which would like to present 1232, an exciting, binge-worthy audio epic from creators Callie Sue and Cheyenne Landry of Rumble Stump Entertainment. Comes a faith-in-action audio adventure for all ages. When the experimental research of a physicist goes awry, his estranged twin children follow him through time to medieval Wales in the year 1232 AD, where they come face to face with a brutal world filled with superstition and legends. Along the way, they meet a penniless leader, a dark sorceress, and a warrior priest who provoke the twins into confronting the truth about themselves, each other, and Jesus Christ. Season 1 of 1232 is available now wherever you get your podcasts or audiobooks. Start listening today to 1232, that's 1232, and visit audioepic.com, that's audio-epic.com, to begin the adventure. Find the links in that cool dramatic audio podcast art in our show notes for this episode, 242, or for this and all the other sponsor info, go to lorehaven.com/podcast. Zach mentioned it. Now here it is. Chapter 1. Why are Lewis and Tolkien absolutely fantastic? We just want to clear the deck of any suspicions here. Yes, Zach and I read newer authors, other Christian authors, other general market authors, or secular authors too. But Lewis and Tolkien are at the top of my bookshelf for a reason. I literally have them at the top, not because I'm an elitist and they're the best, but because they look real good up there. I mean, they are the best, okay? There's no question about that. However, there may, in some dozen or so 100 years' time, might be a newer author who comes along who hits the moment just right and does it better. But for now, Lewis and Tolkien are absolutely fantastic, and there are many reasons why. They wrote into their time, but also had the medieval and Renaissance and literary background to capture the human spirit, to capture deep biblical truths about humanity and sin and virtue and redemption and fallenness and all of that stuff. It's all throughout Lewis's nonfiction and Lewis's fiction. It's all throughout Tolkien's fiction. And just a brief note on Tolkien, it's wonderful to hear an amazing dramatic performer like Andy Serkis, Gollum now and forever, but also everybody else. I listened to Serkis's audiobook of The Hobbit a couple of years ago, and it was fantastic. He performs all the character voices, Gollum included, but his Gandalf is terrific, his Bilbo is terrific, and then in Fellowship, his Frodo is terrific. He does Sam, he does Merry, he does Pippin, he does Strider, he does Barlam and Butterbur, he does Tom Bombadil, and his Tom Bombadil now, to me, is the definitive Tom Bombadil. You barely know it's him. Only a few times does it kind of lapse into his circus narrator voice, but Tom Bombadil, you realize, is just sort of this spoken word poet the whole time. And he breaks into song. He has these little melodies all the time. And I never really felt that Tom Bombadil energy until Serkis gave him voice. And yet it was there in Tolkien all along. The secrets of who Tom is, and he may be the character who comes closest to allegory in Fellowship of the Ring. Gasp! And that's another reason, by the way, and I want to hear Zach's reasons, but that's another reason that Lewis and Tolkien are at the top, is because neither of them really went all in for allegory. I keep seeing people, including the product description for the new full cast audiobook of the Ransom trilogy coming up, or the Space trilogy from Lewis. There's a new full cast version that Zach broke the news to me about a couple episodes ago. And even on the product page, they say it's Lewis's allegory. And like, no, it's not allegory. He literally says that at the beginning of Paralandra. And that's what makes it wonderful, is it is supposal. I think all of Lewis's fiction, with the possible exception of the Pilgrim's Regress, are supposal, meaning that Lewis is thinking in terms of a multiverse. What if there actually was a Narnia and Jesus was active there in ways similar to how he is active here in our world? And for Tolkien, there's not so much a Jesus analog or supposal in the story, but characters are Christian figures like Frodo and Aragorn and Gandalf and all the other heroes. You don't really need a Christ figure in there so much as you have a Christian figure that reminds you of the heroic saints that we know now. You almost have kind of a Marian type figure as well. Tolkien, a legit faithful Catholic, had women like Galadriel. And that's why a lot of people are upset it brings a power, because that version of Galadriel doesn't really behave in a very Marian way. And I think Tolkien would have objected. They have their strengths, Lewis and Tolkien do, in different ways, not because they're allegorical, but because they actually think in terms of a fantastical multiverse where Middle-earth exists and Narnia exists. And I think if you were to try to blend the two, Middle-earth would be at the bottom of one of those pools in Lewis's wood between the worlds. Zach, you caught up a little later to some of these, so you may have a unique perspective on why Lewis and Tolkien are absolutely fantastic.
Yes, but by the way, first I want to issue a correction on something I said the last episode about that full cast audio for the Ransom trilogy. The full cast, I found out, is just for That Hideous Strength. The other two books are going to be a single narrator, but it's the narrator it's one of the narrators in the unabridged Chronicles of Narnia. I forget the guy's name offhand, but yes, the full cast is just for That Hideous Strength, but that's okay, because The Hideous Strength is like 2/3 of the trilogy by length anyway.
Why just That Hideous Strength? I don't understand that. You keep breaking news to me about this Neo full cast audio drama. I guess the Saroni and the Hrasa are very difficult to voice.
Yeah. They couldn't find any Martians, I guess, to voice those, but anyway, that'll still be fantastic. But, I've been thinking about why these books appeal so much. And there's been a lot of comparisons of Middle-earth to Narnia and just the different ways Tolkien and Lewis set about to creating them. In the writerly vocabulary, Tolkien was a plotter, whereas Lewis was a pantser, writing by the seat of his pants and just kind of making it up as he goes along.
The seat of his trousers, rather.
Tolkien was definitely more of like an architect, like planning and plotting and creating the 3,000-year backstory. Like, I always imagine J.R.R. Tolkien, if he had met Jesus and Jesus starts talking about the parable of the prodigal son wandering into a far-off country, Tolkien would probably say, wait a minute. What's the 3,000-year backstory of that far-off country? Like,
what about the languages?
Right, yeah.
we need a whole travelogue of what he met along the way. And
like, he would just slow everything down. Like, we need a whole encyclopedia here to understand this story.
Some readers sneer at that, but maybe it's because I had Circus reading it to me. But in the Fellowship audiobook, I actually took my time going through the woods, and then Merry and Pippin get trapped by Old Man Willow, and then Tom Bombadil just deus ex machinas them out of two crises all at once, or within a couple of days, and then they're rolling around in the grass, and then they take their time getting debris. Like, literally, if you watch the movie, there's a scene where they're on the Buckleberry Ferry, and then they say, how far to the nearest crossing at Brandywine Bridge? 20 miles. And then, like, there's a jump, immediately debris. And if you read the book, like, there's probably weeks of stuff of them going through the woods and getting caught in the Barrow Wight's den and all of this. And yeah, Tolkien does take his time. And I now believe that that's terrific. But I think now, too, that only he can do it.
Yeah, but, the common factor with both these worlds is you can totally get lost in them. Like, there's so much to explore and think about. Even, as you mentioned, the wood between the worlds in The Magician's Nephew. when they go to Charn, this sort of dead world, and they find kind of the ruins of it. I want to hear more about that, right? Like, I would love, I mean, if Lewis could still write it, maybe he's writing it in the New Heavens right now, but I would love to hear the backstory of Charn and how it got that way. We get Jadis's like story of how she ruined it with this one word, which supposedly is an analogy for the A-bomb. It intrigues me so much the way that both of them wrote these full mature worlds that you can't help but just wonder what all happened in it. But I think with both of them, the common factor is that yes, they were both at Oxford as professors, and they were just suffused in literature, and in Lewis's case, the medieval literature. So they just had this rich upbringing in books, but also in life. They were both veterans in World War I, and both took injuries there, and I'm sure had a lot of horrible experiences, but also the bonding that happens through war with your fellow soldier. And so they have these very rich lives. Not that everyone should go sign up to join the Marines or something, but there's just a lot of authors nowadays that think, oh, I can just learn everything from Wikipedia and not go anywhere and not explore and not talk to anyone, much less like go on a real life adventure. But these real life adventures that Tolkien and Lewis went on, I think it very much informed their books.
I think especially for American readers, there's much more of a distance too, not just from these fantasy worlds, which makes them even more magical, but from the lives of Lewis and Tolkien themselves. Some of us tend to be Anglophiles, so we have an appreciation for the mother country and the Great Britain and all of this. But with the separation of distance, culture, and time, the lives of Lewis and Tolkien get even more romantic, and I mean that in a classical sense. Fought in World War II, had this dramatic backstory. Lewis himself arguably suffered a lot of abuse at his boarding school. Tolkien maybe not so much that we know of. And so they brought these experiences into their academic careers. Lewis with his tutor, and Tolkien studying medieval languages, and clearly they connected about that. But there's this whole romantic portrait of these group of men, one a family man married and one a bachelor, and then a couple of others that folks don't know as much about because Lewis and Tolkien are kind of the headliners. And they all get together in the pub and they have a pint at the Eagle and Child, or Bird and Baby is their nickname. And they're talking about their fantasy worlds or their nonfiction. And the story behind the story has just caught wind, especially with American evangelical leaders. They absolutely love the mythos behind Narnia and Middle-earth. And if you go to Wheaton College, for example, there's an entire building, the Wade Center, dedicated to C.S. Lewis memorabilia. But then you also get some Tolkien memorabilia in there. The last time I was there, they actually literally have some of the Lord of the Rings Lego sets, just as an example of Tolkien's legacy. And they have both men's writing desks and at least one wardrobe associated with Lewis. And they're rightfully famous because of what they've done. And also, and we'll get into this a little in chapter 3 too, one of the reasons why I think American evangelical leaders in particular love Lewis and Tolkien is because they had legitimate crossover success in the positive world, lasting into what we would call the neutral world. That is a world that was generally more positive toward public expressions of Christian faith, and then a world that just kind of put up with those. Well, live and let live. That's your faith. You live your faith. I'll live mine. We're arguably no longer in that world. The terms come from Aaron Wrenn, who wrote a book called Life in the Negative World. But Lewis and Tolkien had their origin in that positive world. And so that's one reason why they were able to take off, along with all of their experience and just being a very unique personality. Now, I don't mean they wouldn't take off now, but I'm just saying they could not have been made now. The cultural conditions that made them are now gone. We are not getting another one. And let that be a warning, by the way, to all you aspiring Christian authors who, air quotes, write in the tradition of Lewis and Tolkien. If you didn't fight in World War I, if you don't drink a pint with the fellas at the pub every week or every day or how often it was, and if you're not a student of medieval and Renaissance languages who could write fluent Latin to the Catholic guy down there in Italy in your letters, then you're arguably not in the Lewis and Tolkien tradition, and that's okay. Forge your own tradition. And we'll get to that in just a bit.
Yeah, I think there's another factor, though, about why we love Lewis and Tolkien, it's because they had a long history of faithfulness. They never turned away from it, and not that they were perfect men, but that they ended well. They ended their race well. And, that's not always the case nowadays, and we'll talk about that more in chapter 2. But, Stephen, as I mentioned in the opening, I have so many books, but I actually just looked up a bibliography of both these authors, and I still got more Lewis books to collect. I thought I had just about them all. I have a couple of them only as ebooks, like his unfinished book, The Dark Tower, and not to be confused with the Stephen King Dark Tower. With Tolkien, it's actually a little bit harder for me to understand some of his bibliography because most of it is posthumous, like it was edited by his son Christopher Tolkien or others, including the Silmarillion, which is sort of the boss, the final boss of the the Lord of the Rings. But there's all these unfinished tales, the history of, a guide to, the children of, the fall of, the collected poems. There's just so many other things, and I looked at this. I'm like, okay, I still have quite a bit more. But with the Chronicles of Narnia, I think we have 4 different versions of it. We've got the paperbacks that are in color. We've got the 1990s hardbacks that are black and white. I've got a 8.5 by 11 omnibus that's full color. That's the one I read to my kids. But then I've got a more traditional hardback omnibus, black and white, that's that I just like to read. And then we also have the audiobooks, the full cast from Focus on the Family. And eventually I want to get the unabridged single narrator, more straight read. So that'll be my 6th version, I guess. But I totally get, the appeal of wanting just more Lewis and Tolkien because there's still more to get. And, and I'll just confess, like most of these books that I have by both these authors, I haven't even read yet. I've only scratched the surface, really. As you said, I came to not only these books, but really the Christian faith later in my life, much later than you did. And so I love that I still have many of these to explore ahead of me. And so I can totally get, someone who's, if you're a listener and you're, your 20s, your early 30s, you're thinking, man, I've only read Narnia. I've only read The Hobbit. Like I got to catch up and read all these books. Like, do it. Like we definitely want to encourage that here on this podcast. Like that's never a question.
Absolutely. Zach, send me a picture of your Lewis and Tolkien shelves if they're easily photographable, and then I will see if I can put that in our Instagram this week, along with a picture of my shelf. Maybe we'll make it a friendly competition as to who has more books from either author or both combined. I may have a slight edge there because I married a Lewis and Tolkien fan, so we combined our books about 15, 16 years ago. Hey, by the way, listeners, I don't know if we have a prize to give away for this, but you may just have bragging rights. Let us know how many Lewis books you have total. No extra points for duplicate titles. Or should we do extra points for duplicate titles? No, extra points for duplicate titles. Okay, if you've got 3 Narnia sets, then that's 21 points. And if you have multiple copies of the Silmarillion, that should also count. That just means you're even more of a stan. And email us, podcast@lorehaven.com, or tag us on social media. Search out Lorehaven on Facebook, Instagram, or X, and we'll give you a shout out if it turns out that you have the most books. And present your shelfies too. Present photographic evidence for others to nitpick. And we'll see who wins by the end, which I think at this point is just going to be bragging rights. I hope that you'll add one more book to your shelf, although not in the tradition of Lewis and Tolkien necessarily. I'm going to do my own thing, and that's because I'm the second sponsor for this episode. Myself, E. Stephen Burnett, author of that aforementioned sci-fi novel launching in March 2025 from Enclave Publishing called Above the Circle of Earth. This is more literal science fiction set in the next century. The negative world, it seems, has continued, and unfortunately, the consequences have hit young husband Brock Rivers, who grew up in a religious preserve, a district where you are allowed to practice your faith freely, but not so much outside. But Brock was raised in this Christian organization, and he decided, I'm going to push back on that a little bit. Unfortunately, he and his young wife went and got in trouble in the city and ended up exiled to Mars, where they had to spend 7 years eking out an existence and supporting their young family until adventure comes calling, and they are called back to Earth to restart missions in the 22nd century in space. But out there in space is the cause, the humanist technocracy that supervises all settlement in the solar system. And they're not going to be very happy about that. But also, there are some critics within their own people. So Brock and Alicia Rivers have their work cut out for them. They're going to have to fight for the space mission starting in their home world. And this novel releases from Enclave in March in hardcover and digital ebook, that is, as well as an audiobook. We're done with the book now, just working on the audiobook, and you can get more updates by signing up free at estephenburnett.com. Pre-order at the Enclave store, the hardcover, and you get 20% off. But you can also order from Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all those folks. Get all the links and see that awesome cover in the show notes for this episode 242 for Above the Circle of Earth. Chapter 2, Zach, where and how are we seeing Lewis and Tolkien onlyism? I've mentioned there's no book about this that I've seen. I haven't seen anyone write an article about this. So hopefully we're catching this one early before it gets to that point. And I will say, Zach, I want to know your examples. But I first became dimly aware of this when, because of Lorehaven, I mean, this isn't just about my book, but I'm recommending like more than a year ago. I've done this over half my life now. Finding fantastic Christian storytellers who are still alive, who are still making great stories. And I tell people about them. I tell people about these books that I love. And occasionally, especially from kind of Theo Bro types, Lord bless them, but I've had people tell me or strongly imply, well, why would I need that new story? Why bother with the new stuff? I got my Lewis. I got my Tolkien. I'm good, man. I don't need any of that modern stuff. I'm kind of suspicious of that stuff. So in my case, this is a sentiment that I'm seeing in casual conversations with certain kinds of readers, usually nonfiction fans, the type of guys who will read pastoral resources and doctrine and politics and history and current events and such like. And they will occasionally read some fiction and maybe even some fantasy, but for them, it's Lewis and or Tolkien only. And so I made up this ism called Lewis and Tolkien onlyism. And it's often among conservatives. I will say, like Christian conservatives, cultural conservatives, like this is a sentiment that is spreading. And I'm finding it frankly a little annoying. And so I thought, well, let's just talk about it on this show. But it starts with the examples, and we want to try to understand this view and certainly not be obnoxious and saying, well, you shouldn't just like those guys. You should like these others. Like, no, I want to win you all over. I want to kind of deconstruct your position according to your own expectations and then remind you of some truths that you might be missing. But first, we got to understand what we're dealing with here. So, Zach, you've seen a little of this too. How and where have you seen this view occurring, even in its earliest form?
Yeah, so I have seen this in kind of two different phenomenon. So I'm going to call the direct and the indirect phenomenon, which is sort of my optimistic and pessimistic version. So let me talk about the optimistic side of this, or sort of the indirect phenomenon. And I think this is mostly being driven by parents. So a lot of parents take their kids to the library, the local bookstore, browse through Amazon, and they start to get concerned with what's being forwarded in these bookstores and libraries, especially if the library is driven by an activist type, political type, or the local bookstore is, which is most of the cases that we often see, unless you're in a more rural county with a smaller, county library. If you're in a city, you've definitely seen the pride flags and everything that goes with that, the front of the store. And then you start to see this combination of those things with the fantasy books that are on display. And as your kids start reading them and you talk about them, you're like, wait a minute, are these even stories, or is this just pagan propaganda disguised as a story and just political activism? Is there even a story here, much less a good story, much less anything to do with our Christian faith? And so parents will just kind of hit a breaking point with this and say, you know what, we're going to go to a trusted source because of the Pareto principle. Lewis and Tolkien, having been around now for 80 years, those books, it's just more people know about them, and it's kind of the default that we go to. Like, well, a lot of my friends loved J.R.R. Tolkien, and or my pastor quotes C.S. Lewis, so I'm sure we can trust those because I don't know who else to trust, and my kids need to read a book right now. So let me give them Narnia, let me give them Middle Earth, and then we'll just kind of go from there and see what happens. I don't think there's anything wrong with this impulse. I think it's just the best that a lot of parents can do. But then it's very easy to get stuck there because it's like, I got really burned when I went to this store, or that library, or that recommended Goodreads list, and I don't want to lead my kids astray. I take it very seriously what Jesus said about millstones and everything. I don't want to give my kids something that's going to deconstruct their faith. And then I think you couple that with there's just an unawareness of modern, newer Christian authors. Again, this is just sort of the indirect phenomenon that happens.
Yeah, and that awareness problem is one that Lorehaven has sought to rectify. And there are many other authors and organizations who are getting the word out. And so we too are in the earlier stages of this. I saw a comment from someone who'd posted in a Realm Makers group, hey, what can anybody tell me about Enclave Publishing? And to me and to you and a bunch of folks, I've been familiar with the Enclave name now for 10 years. It used to be called Marcher Lord Press, and then it was bought and it's been remade. It was remade in 2014. So it's been around for 10 years. And yet to me, it's that perception of it always having been around. I have had many Enclave books on my shelf as well. It's a sizable portion of my other Christian fantastical authors shelves, which I think are 3 or 4 shelves at this point, not including my Left Behind series shelf, whereas Lewis and Tolkien get 1 shelf each, but each one of those is 2 different authors. So there's many different authors across different fantasy genres represented on my other Christian authors fantasy shelf. So Zach, you're saying the indirect form is mainly based on familiarity and
Right.
and legitimate concern with newer authors, these newer, generally secular authors. Whereas generally, if you look for specifically Christian-made fantasy, you will find like-mindedness. With some exceptions, you will find authors. I know there are some glitches here and there, but you will generally find authors who would ascribe to an orthodox statement of faith similar to the one we have at Lorehaven, and would be members of local churches who do not want to tempt children, who do not want to go all political activist, or who are not getting into the identity nonsense, but hopefully aren't just writing clean fiction. They're writing wholesome fiction that will actually be a nutritious diet for your kids or for yourself. So that's happening indirectly. Zach, what about the direct approach?
Yeah, so it's sort of the inverse of this whole phenomenon. So you mentioned authors that are getting into identity nonsense, racial identitarianism or sexualityism, the political and sort of progressive activism, but in the guise of Christianity. There's definitely a lot of that, and it's sort of the same principle that the controversial things rise to the top, as well as the trusted historical things that the faithful authors rise to the top. The controversial authors rise to the top. And so I don't blame a lot of parents and other readers who hear some of these controversies and they start to wonder, is this all Christian fantasy? Like, is this all Christian sci-fi? Is it going to lead me down this rabbit trail where I deconstruct my faith, or where I turn to what Paul warned about in 1 Timothy 4:7, have nothing to do with godless myths and old wives' tales? It's like I'm already taking a leap in going into this fantastical world of fiction. It's way beyond my comfort zone of inspirational fiction. Am I also going to fall into these fantastical myths about God himself, or the Bible, or Christian ethics, or sexuality, or whatever? Because I'm starting to see a lot of these authors or musicians or artists kind of dabble with this stuff. And I think a lot of readers, rightly suspect that a lot of artists are prone to wandering away. Stephen, this is a question that's plagued me since I started a job really in Christian media about 14 years ago. I started to notice that there's this tendency among artists to to sort of dabble and kind of stick their toes over the line and just kind of push a lot of boundaries. And some of that is the job of an artist, but it can sort of snowball into some other things. And so I think what happens with a lot of readers, and as you mentioned, theobros, parents, pastors, whoever, that it sort of hardens into this suspicion that, maybe we shouldn't really read fiction at all. And if you're going to read fiction, just keep it to Lewis and Tolkien, because we don't have to worry about them. Everyone else, give them a few decades and then we'll see what happens.
There are some readers for whom it's a badge of honor, and frankly kind of an elitist posturing, because they will think and imply and sometimes state outright, I only read authors who are dead. Well, this is a nice way of saying that you only read folks who are good and safe for you. And I'll answer that with one of Lewis's famed slogans in the next chapter, that whole idea of safety. But I would say, well, I'll save the rebuttal later, but I've literally heard people say this, but the way you explain it, Zach, makes sense, is because if Lewis and Tolkien are safe because they are dead, then you don't have to worry about them taking some turn into liberalism or the agenda or the wokeness or any of those things, or turning to, the opposite way into some sort of right-wing nonsense, some radical red pill type thing. There are some red pill guys who appreciate Lewis and Tolkien, but they are rather transcendent of all of our modern categories and controversies. There are a few, but
I just
like
ran across a guy that was praising Tolkien for supporting Franco in the Spanish Civil War, and basically we need a modern day Franco. And I'm like, you're on your own there. I don't know what to say to that.
Yeah, so. Well, and Tolkien's also immunized against anti-Semitism, because there's that one letter where he very classily but firmly rebuked Hitler and what he was doing against the Jewish people. So Tolkien, I mean, he's a boss. Lewis is a boss.
Yeah.
Both of them had rather decent, biblically informed views on war, but they're not known for dabbling in that stuff. They were talking about transcendent stuff.
As I said, there is that dangerous impulse a lot of times with artists of wanting the new thing, trying the new, I got this new idea. I got this new insight. And that can definitely be a trap. And it's kind of what 1 John 2 talks about. They went ahead of us. They went beyond us. They went into this uncharted theological territory that unfortunately can accompany the uncharted artistic territory. And so then a lot of Christians look at that and go, I'm going to go the other way. I'm going to go with something that's not new. I'm going to go with something that's old and that I don't have to worry about, as you said, but that has stood the test of time. And look, that's not a bad impulse. Like I totally understand that. There's a lot of nonfiction books that come out nowadays. I'm like, I'm going to give that a few years before I read that. I'm going to give that author a little time to mature and see if they still stand by those words. Because I've been burned with this myself. Like, this is a whole other podcast, but when I was in high school, the I Kissed Dating Goodbye book came out. And that was the talk of the town. And then I get to college, and college pastors are like, look, we got to address this. There's some good ideas and a lot of bad ideas. And now that author has come full circle and unpublished those books and basically walked away from the faith. And so we've all kind of been through cycles like that where we're like, I don't know about this. So I just want to say to the person with that impulse that's a good instinct you have, but you can't stay there. Life is an adventure. Life is risk sometimes. Not that we should risk our theology. We need to watch our life and doctrines closely. Absolutely. But we can't live in these safety bubbles and everything. So we've got to move out of that. It's just not practical to live there all the time.
Well, let's talk more about that in chapter 3. I, too, am eager to own this view with grace and truth and facts and logic, but not without stopping by our third sponsor, which is empty at this time of year. So I'm taking it again, but this time for Lorehaven, lorehaven.com, that resource. It's an informal nonprofit, really. A group of fans of Christian-made stories, Lewis and Tolkien and beyond, who want to reach more readers and make them aware of these kinds of stories and find the best ones. That's why we offer reviews every week when we can, and these on-screen articles and other articles about Christian-made stories that are making a difference. And we also, this year especially, have been doing more short takes on movies and streaming and video games and such, and that's our on-screen features. I think, Zach, there was a time when I thought, yeah, that's pretty well covered by other Christian writers, but I happen to know of a lot of publications that really struggle to put out takes on the newest movies. And when they do, it's sometimes a few weeks later, and or it's a great big old article that maybe is a little less accessible to some folks. So we do short takes and timely takes with our on-screen features. And we have these other articles monitoring what's going on with the Christian fantastical universe and the reviews, in addition to this podcast, which is weekly, 50 episodes a year now. And we're just getting started rolling into the 2025 season. So we'd like you to join this mission and tell a friend about Lorehaven and this podcast. Do send your favorite episode of this podcast. Send a link from lorehaven.com or however you get your podcasts. Send a link to your favorite episode to a friend or family member if you think they're going to enjoy it. We have stuff about Lewis and Tolkien and newer authors like Andrew Peterson and Mike Naraki and a bunch of those other guys who've blessed us with their presence on the show. Send your favorite episode to a friend, and then if you like, tag us on social media when you do that. And we'd love to jump in there and tell folks about this and spread the good word about this newer, fantastic, Christian-made, fantastical world. Sign up free at lorehaven.com/subscribe as well. Chapter 3, how do we rebut Lewis and Tolkien onlyism? Well, Zach already gave a rebuttal, and I think that's based firmly on Scripture. I want to expand on that just a little bit. There's a meaning to the word conservative that Zach articulated there, and it is a healthy impulse to not chase after the new shiny baubles just because it's new and shiny and on trend, and you think that'll be a great way to succeed and get cooler friends and be cooler yourself. That is something that Lewis and Tolkien rightly warned against. Sometimes you got to leave the party tree. You don't just want to chop it down in order to burn in the fires of industry, as Saruman in the movie said. It's good to leave the tree up. It's good to honor the past. It's good to honor tradition and not just go chasing after trends. However, if God himself had followed that view, then he would have only ever existed as God, one God, three persons in eternity, in perfect love and holiness. But God himself, for good reasons, decided to create new things. So in Genesis 1, he creates a universe ex nihilo, out of nothing. And he decides to set this entire glorious gospel plot line into action. And then, most importantly for us there, call human beings to do the same. He calls them in the first commandment documented in the Bible, Genesis 1:28. He tells Adam and Eve in the garden, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the birds of the air and the fish of the sea and the creatures of the earth. He tells them to make new stuff using the stuff he's made. So there are both instincts there, conserving the good things that God has made and preserving them and honoring them, but then using them to make other good things. Now, there's more to be said, and we've said it, about the interference of sin there and temptations in different directions. But I would say that the temptations we struggle with do include something like Lewis and Tolkienism. Let's freeze the creative process. Let's declare that a particular era of history, such as the 1940s to 1950s, are the best. And let's treat these resources not just as time-tested and wonderful and familiar and safe. Let's treat them as the absolute best. And this instinct is not really based on Scripture. It's based on something that actually Ecclesiastes 7:10 warns against. The preacher says, why are we asking, the good old days were better than this? And he says, it is not wise to ask such questions. So it's a caution against impulsive nostalgia that is not biblical, that can lead to some to very bad thought patterns. And I would wager, Zach, that folks who are Lewis and Tolkien onlyism, or onlyists, or who are tempted toward this view, would not apply the same standards to new things that they enjoyed growing up. Almost certainly, some of the Theo bros that seem to imply this view I don't think that they are in churches that follow just an old tradition impulsively. I'm guessing there would be drums or electric guitars at some of their churches and not just the big old pipe organ or the honky tonk piano. I'm sure that they are perfectly open to other traditions and making new people. After all, a lot of them are dads. So if you froze your life the way you want to freeze your literature, I don't think you would have gotten married and had kids or tried to forge ahead with your career. You are absolutely doing new stuff. You like music and books and TV shows and movies that your parents didn't like or didn't know about. You're absolutely open to new things everywhere else. And if you're not, I will also say, well, I'll save what I'll say until later. But Zach, I want you to chime in here. Like this idea of freezing the era. Do you think that is an issue, and how would you respond to that?
Yeah, I would just respond that Lewis and Tolkien did not do that themselves, obviously.
Amen.
So I found this book recently. I'm really intrigued to look at it. I had no idea this even existed. It came out about 15 years ago. It's called Tales Before Narnia: The Roots of Modern Fantasy and Science Fiction. And it's a collection of about 20 or so stories that inspired C.S. Lewis and the Chronicles of Narnia.
I'm getting one. This sounds great.
Yep. So, for example, The Snow Queen by Hans Christian Andersen, that was a huge influence on him. And, there's a bunch of these. And the author says these are the tributaries that fed the creative impulse of Narnia. I love how he explains this. Lewis has talked also about how George MacDonald baptized his imagination. I've actually collected a couple of MacDonald books that I'm going to read. I know we've done one in the Lorehaven Guild as a book quest. Lewis talked about The Fairy Queen by Edmund Spenser, which Sky Turtle Press, part of Oasis Family Media, they did a Kickstarter to bring The Fairy Queen, which is a epic poem, into modern day prose, but still maintaining the classical structure of it. That's going to be a 3-volume hardback set. I backed that on Kickstarter.
Yeah, so did I. I think it's going to come out this year too. I think they're finally ready to release.
Coming very soon. Yeah, so Lewis did not see literature this way, and neither did Tolkien. Books are part of, there's this phrase that's used, that literature is the great conversation. One book inspires the next. And so, like, if we only read up through Lewis and Tolkien, and it's sort of like cutting off a conversation before it can go any further. And again, likewise, if we don't read what came before, then it's like you said, it's just ex nihilo. These books came out of nowhere, and that's not how books are made. The influence of one book leads to a next. So it's the ordinary thing to read the whole spectrum of books as they come out, and sort of this, because it's this chain that links together.
So, Zach, you mentioned correctly, Lewis and Tolkien read other books, obviously not just their own. And there's a rather obvious logical point there, is that if Lewis and Tolkien themselves embraced this view of only read old books, then they would not have made their new ones, which became our old books. So, your heroes don't believe the things that you believe. They would reject such an idealism about the past. They'd say, well, Lewis would say, well, why do we need C.S. Lewis? We have George MacDonald, or we have G.K. Chesterton, or we have these old medieval books that I love so much, reading them in their original languages. Like, Lewis knew that he needed to write new stuff for his era. That's how we got the radio talks that led to Mere Christianity, or The Great Divorce, or Problem of Pain, or any of those nonfiction. Even before he did the Narnia series, Tolkien himself, as we mentioned last year's episode about Lewis and Tolkien on Christmas traditions, Tolkien himself blended some of the newer ideas of Father Christmas with the legends of St. Nicholas, and he made, sort of for his era, this modern mythos for Father Christmas / St. Nicholas at the North Pole, with his sleigh and a bumbling polar bear, and kind of this mix of old European mythology and newer ideas of St. Nicholas on his sleigh delivering gifts at Christmas. So Tolkien made new stuff using new ideas, and so did Lewis. Lewis read widely, not only the old books, but an underappreciated side of him is that Lewis read pulp sci-fi, science fiction, it was called back then. And we know this because there's a whole transcribed conversation about it with some other authors that I have in a collection of obscure Lewis books. But you don't even have to go to the obscure stuff. It's right at the beginning of The Great Divorce with his introduction to that story. Lewis says he's indebted to an author whose name he doesn't even remember, or else he would credit him, who was writing a story about, it would seem, a guy frozen in time for whom water, for example, like a flowing river, is just locked in time so he could walk straight across it and not sink in because it's locked in time and he is not. Same thing with like the blades of grass being very sharp because they don't bend because time is frozen. So Lewis borrowed from this for his vision of paradise and how that would look for someone who's still in their sin, who isn't solid enough for that world. It's a pulp science fiction story, a new story that Lewis read. And Lewis himself would have counted his own books as new. For him, it wasn't, Lewis and Tolkien, the classically romantic, old professors meeting at the pub and then spinning yarns out of nothing. Wow, what legends. Like, they weren't legends necessarily in their own time. They're legendary now. But Lewis himself wrote, quote, "It is a good rule, after reading a new book, never to allow yourself another new one till you have read an old one in between. If that is too much for you, you should at least read one old one to every 3 new ones." So 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 ratio. Lewis encouraging normal people to read 2 new books and then read an old book in between. Or maybe a 3-to-1 ratio of new to old. I think a lot of people would reverse that, or they would say, hey, no new books at all. Like, I'm not going to read any book that wasn't published since that was published since 1980. And that's just a very strange and unhelpful view.
Yeah, and I, on my bookshelf here next to me, I've got one shelf of modern science fiction that's basically been written since I've, been alive, but mostly in the last 10 or 20 years. And then I've got another shelf of more of the classic sci-fi, going back to Asimov and sort of the golden age of science fiction to the, the 60s, the Frank Herbert era, and then sort of the later, 70s and 80s, Kim Stanley Robinson, Carl Sagan era. And, I've, I obviously have a problem of collecting more books than I'm probably able to read in this life. But a lot of this is aspirational, right? But I want to recognize that, everything stands on the shoulder of giants, right? So everything that's come out, it was inspired by something older. And, I don't want to just, like I said, cut off the conversation at a certain point in time arbitrarily. Now, I totally recognize, as I said in chapter 1, that a lot of the newer books are very agenda prone, and it's really not even a story; it's just propaganda. Totally understand that, and that's a big thing that we try to do here on Lorehaven. But even in the secular market, you can look for these clues in Amazon reviews of things of like, oh, it's just a great story, finally, like a non-political book or whatever. There's still good things that are happening out there because there's still common grace. And I think sometimes, Stephen, this Lewis and Tolkien onlyism is really just kind of a theological mistake that people make of basically not holding to the idea of common grace. Jesus said that the rain falls on the good and the wicked because of God's love. And I don't think he's just talking about the physical rain. I think he's talking about in the world of literature, the reign of inspiration, the reign of creativity. People who are not believers are still very creative. They're made in the image of God. They have that impulse in them. Now, yes, there's going to be a lot more dangers, I guess, in the art and the music and the books made by non-believers, but there are still very creative things happening in those spaces. And then especially, in the Christian world, there are many new things happening. And I think the other impulse, the wrong impulse, I think, that people can fall into, because I've fallen into this, is the idea that our best days are behind us, rather than the best days are yet to come. So look, without getting into eschatology, I think we can say we all believe Jesus is going to come back. We all believe that there's going to be new heavens and new earth. So automatically, we all believe the best days are ahead of us. They're not behind us. Now, how that plays out here on earth, yeah, we're going to debate that. But I think that optimism that the best days are ahead of us, I think that will absolutely lead to better and better stories as time goes on.
Amen, Zach. The best corrective to something like Lewis and Tolkien onlyism is sound theology. And theology proper starts with a proper and biblical understanding of who God is. God himself never changes. However, God does do new things on purpose, and that is for our benefit. He wants his glory to fill the cosmos that he has made, and his entire project for thousands of years has been in pursuit of that goal for his glory and our good. So he does new things. He says in Psalm 96:1, "Oh, sing to the Lord a new song. Sing to the Lord, all the earth." And so I would challenge folks, Theo Bros included, God bless you, brother. But how do you feel then about music? Do you only want to sing Gregorian chants? Well, you could make a case that that's the conservative
those
view.
were really hot in the 90s.
They were really hot in the 90s, like the 790s maybe. But yeah, or would you only sing, the praise and worship music from the Jesus movement in the 70s? Like, you could make an argument for all of these being the conservative position. Now, I don't mean that all new music is good, but I'll wager that there's some overlap between the worship wars and Lewis and Tolkien onlyism. Do you really want only to, well, some of them might, get rid of all new instruments, all new music, including fantastic new hymns that have great theology in them and that are musically sound? Do you want to get rid of all those things and freeze the hymns back in the 50s? Probably not. I would say that that's not just a violation of theology, but maybe biblical anthropology, because God has made a dynamic world where there are people who love music and stories who are different ages and personalities and cultural backgrounds, and they love different kinds of stories. And Zach, you mentioned eschatology. The new heavens and new earth will have the honor and glory of all the nations brought into that future city, the New Jerusalem. Revelation 21:26 is the reference there. We live in light of that glorious future. I'm trying to avoid using the buzzword diversity here, but that's the better meaning of that word. And I think a better word to say is just differences. There are different ways to reflect God's glory back to him, not just a particular language or era or even genre of story. And so a special challenge then goes out to Christians who are parents who are trying to find great stories for their kids and who may be tempted toward something like Lewis and Tolkien onlyism. I think that if you were to pursue that view in earnest, you're probably going to frustrate your kids just as much as you yourself would have been frustrated if your parents told you, "Well, son, why are you always reading that Tolkien garbage? Like, you ought to be out there hunting and fishing and doing the sports." Please don't commit the same error, only in a nerdier way. You don't want to restrict your sons and daughters from other great stories by Christian authors, and maybe some non-Christian authors too, who simply are blessed with common grace, like Zach said. You don't want to restrict and frustrate your kids that way. I would say, for example, it's probably my biggest hyper-relevant point here in terms of applying what kinds of stories you get for your kids. Lewis wrote the Ransom trilogy, which is for grown-ups and maybe teen prodigies, and he wrote the Chronicles of Narnia, which is the earliest reading group would probably be kids in middle school, maybe a prodigy who's still in elementary school, or just you read it out loud to your 6-year-old who's able to understand generally what's going on. Like, parents can decide differently, but generally the optimal age groups for both of those is young children and grown-ups. There's a lot of space in between there. And the greatest space there, I would say, is YA fantasy. Now, among newer Christian authors, YA fantasy is the absolute king genre. It's a big fish in a small pond, but the pond is getting bigger. We're pouring more common grace rains on it, hopefully. And so there's going to be more fish swimming around there, including hopefully science fiction novels, a little professional interest in that there. But Lewis and Tolkien don't quite exactly appeal to a lot of teen girls readers. Like, I mean, they may have grown up with Narnia and they still like it, but dads especially, like, your teenage girl might not be as eager to get into the Lord of the Rings as you are. Maybe they would like a wholesome, Christ-exalting romantasy story or a cozy fantasy. Look, it's not my favorite genre, but lots of girls love these stories, teenagers and young adults. And lots of boys like other kinds of stories, like graphic novels or some of these, middle grade readers. Like, there's a lot of space in between Lewis and Tolkien, in between Narnia and Middle Earth. And there are many Christian storytellers, faithful ones, excellent ones, creating stories in this space. And parents, please don't frustrate your children by going into something like Lewis and Tolkien onlyism. Please stay open to these kinds of stories, just like hopefully good Christians were open to these kinds of stories that you were enjoying. And be open to the fact that God has made different readers with different preferences, and that is for his glory. There's so many faithful creators sharing stories in this space, and I think Lewis and Tolkien themselves would generally approve of these newer authors just as much as they themselves would want you to read and enjoy the classic works, the now classic works that they have created.
Well, to you, our listener, we would like to know, have you ever drifted into a Lewis and Tolkien onlyism view? Or have you found your way out of that? Did you read the books that inspired C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia, or the books that inspired Tolkien, or the ones that were directly, that came after that were inspired by them, or further down the chain? Send us your thoughts to podcast@lorehaven.com, or find us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And we want to go to a listener email that we got from Caleb about episode 241, where we asked, what are the best and worst fantastical Christmas stories? And Caleb says, quote, loved your discussion on Christmas movies. I would like to submit for your consideration Little Women, 1994 version. It came out at Christmas time. It features Christmas dinner and Christmas carols and amazing music and Christmas themes. I like to watch it around Christmas time, even though you could watch it anytime. Other comments, Santa Claus is Coming to Town is the best of the classic animated Christmas TV specials. It wonderfully tells a story of bravery, love, and redemption. Muppets Christmas Carol is probably my favorite version of that story. Although special mention goes out to Doctor Who Christmas Special, where the 11th Doctor, Matt Smith, plays the ghost of Christmas past and present to a sci-fi future Scrooge. This might deserve an entire Fantastical Truth episode, as the Doctor essentially uses story and adventures that create new childhood memories to reprogram the imagination of the cold-hearted miser in order to give him a heart of flesh, thereby saving his soul and the lives of hundreds of people. Come to think of it, that is very similar to Dickens' story at its heart. Maybe A Christmas Carol is the OG Fantastical Truth Christmas fiction. A faithful follower, Caleb, in quote. Caleb, I am not as much of a Doctor Who fan as Steven, so I'm going to see if he has a comment here, but I definitely got to check that out. And I think you're right. That probably could be an entire episode. And maybe, we can search for other fantastical versions of that classic tale. And I mean, I would even put the Muppets in that category because, okay, that's still pretty fantastical. And I absolutely love the performance of Michael Caine. I only just found that movie a year ago. And there's that meme where, the producer is talking to Michael Caine saying, okay, look, this is a kid's movie. Like you can loosen up a little bit. And Michael Caine replies, I'm going to play this as serious as a heart attack.
I'm going to play this story as serious as a heart attack. My best Caine impression there Candy Caine in Muppet Christmas Carol. This letter, thanks for it, Caleb, actually reflects the theme of this episode, because I've been around long enough to remember even early reviews of that Little Women 1994 movie. I never saw it. Gasp. I know. I'll go see it eventually. All I know is that that's the one with a very young father. What's her name? Mary Jane. She played Mary Jane Watson. I remember she was in this one. And I remember seeing early reviews that were comparing this movie to earlier adaptations, because in 1994, this was the new thing. It was therefore suspect. And now, what do you know? 30 years later, people look back on this as a classic. I remember early reviews of A Muppet Christmas Carol. They were just kind of, it's the Muppets reenacting the Charles Dickens classic. And now, many, many years later, it too is a classic. So the new stuff becomes classic. And I, by the way, absolutely love that 11th Doctor Christmas special, written by Stephen Moffat back when New Doctor Who was good, in which the 11th Doctor confronts Kezran Sardik, played by the late Sir Michael Gambon, who played Dumbledore in most of the Harry Potter films, who was absolutely terrific as this Scrooge analog on another planet. And the classic line, or it should be classic line there, is the Doctor musing to himself that time can be rewritten. And Sardik exclaims, "But people can't." And so the Doctor, acting almost as a kind of supernatural regenerating force, pops back into the video footage that the Scrooge character is playing for himself of a bad Christmas. And then suddenly the memory, the person is being rewritten before our eyes. And yes, that breaks some and creates so many predestination paradoxes, but you just got to roll with it. It is a fantasy with sci-fi trappings.
Yes.
And it's deeply Judeo-Christian in its worldview. It's an author, Stephen Moffat, who comes out of the negative world, and so is perfectly fine with those tropes. Now it's all been captured, and enough said about that. But Zach, I own this Christmas special on Blu-ray. I will loan it to you along with Arthur Christmas, and so I guess then you owe me too. But it's absolutely wonderful, and you don't have to know much about Doctor Who other than the general premise to enjoy it. It's actually a pretty good entry point, and it's totally standalone.
All right, well, I'll have to do that. And Stephen, you saying that Doctor Who is fantasy with sci-fi tropes, I think that kind of unlocked it for me. Perhaps it's what's turned me away from that, and like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, those kind of whimsical, much more fantastical stories than I'm used to, like, compared to like The Expanse or Kim Stanley Robinson, the more hard sci-fi. It's definitely not in that category. But I'm realizing, a lot of sci-fi, it's on a spectrum, right? From hard to soft sci-fi, more serious, more whimsical, serious as a heart attack kind of thing. So I will definitely check that out.
Well, Doctor Who is one of those shows that when it was good, even new Doctor Who honored the past and fans noticed. They had some fun with it here and there, but most of the time they were in deadly earnest, even with these weird-looking creatures that are their versions of the 60s characters in the rubber suits. It's a great way to make new things while also honoring the good old things. And we do want to see more stories like that, don't we? Going into the new year while honoring the old year. Next on Fantastical Truth, next week, Zach and I, are taking a Christmas Eve break. Tuesday falls on December 24th in both hemispheres this year. But 1 week later, we will return with our first Fantastical Truth New Year's Eve special, answering the question, which top 10 episodes of this podcast, as well as articles at lorehaven.com, did readers and listeners love most in the last year? We will survey all of these and give some fun updates to these topics to close out our 2024 podcast season. Well, this side of the holiday break, Zach and I hope and pray that you will have as happy a Christmas as you possibly can. Even though griefs may mount, the holiday season is difficult for many. I hope that you'll be able to honor the good traditions of the past, but also enjoy new stories, not just reading them or watching them over your holiday rest time, but making new ones, making new memories with your family as we honor the God who is unchanging, but also creates new things, and we continue to seek and find his fantastical truth.